Hello, this is Grandin Gill, and this is part 2 of a series that is being created on constructing research papers. And these slides are based upon a presentation that was made at the Insight 2019 conference in Jerusalem. And the intended audience is individuals who have got experience in research methods, but perhaps have not written a great many research papers, and as a consequence need just a little help dealing with the blank page. In this video, part 2 of the series, what we're going to look at is a generic research paper, and we'll take a more in-depth look at the type of material that you want to put in each section. The structure that we're going to talk about in this presentation is what I refer to as the LIFO manuscript design, which is last in, first out. And it was suggested to me by my colleague, Dr. G.J. DeVreda, who was jointly teaching a publication course with me in the Doctor of Business Administration program here at the University of South Florida, where I work. And the idea of this structure is that you organize your sections according to a plan whereby each section towards the end refers to a section that precedes it. And in the example we have here, the idea is the last section you covered is the first to be uncovered in the second half of the paper. So working from the inside out, you have a method section, and that basically is closed out by the results, which we call the execution cycle. Then you have a series of background sections, including the literature review, the research model, and so forth. And that gets closed out in the discussion section. Here you're focusing on the contribution. Finally, your paper has an introduction, and that introduction, which positions the paper, is closed out by the conclusion. Now, this is kind of a mechanical way to go about writing a paper. But if you're not used to paper writing, it provides a nice formula for constructing a paper that reviewers are going to be able to follow. And if you're a very experienced paper writer, you can depart from this in all sorts of ways. There's no right and wrong here. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation is specifically designed for people who don't have a lot of experience writing research papers. One section of a paper that I did not show in the previous diagram is the abstract. And some journals have abstracts that are formatted into sections, so you really don't have much control over it. But if you're just asked to write an abstract, here are some of the things that you should think about. First off, the purpose of an abstract is to summarize, not to essentially introduce ideas. It's not the same as an introduction. And it also is what is going to be used in many of the search engines to determine when your paper pops up or what order it pops up in. So you will normally have a set of keywords. The key thing is your goal is to create a summary. You are not trying to introduce new ideas. And the contents of the abstract should not make promises for the paper. Rather, they should account for results. They should explain what was found and not talk about what was planned, which is often different from what was found. And you don't want to put sentences at the end of your abstract, such as the implications of the research are discussed, because that doesn't really add any value to the reader. Everything in your abstract should add value to the reader, and abstracts are normally short, and make sure that you stay within whatever page limits the outlet that you're writing for specifies. So the main purpose of the introduction section is to position the paper in the mind of the reader and give the reader a sense of what's coming. And in the LIFO structure, the things that you mention in the introduction are likely to be things that you revisit in the conclusion. So if we take a look at the key elements of an introduction, we normally want to explain why the topic studied in the paper is important. What are the bigger issues that are being addressed in the paper or that the paper helps to address? We want to establish the boundaries of what we're going to be looking at in the paper. That will help the reader decide whether it makes sense to go on. We want to identify the theoretical focus that we're taking. This is particularly important in your standard empirical research paper, where we're actually doing empirical research that relates to theory. And we want to identify the fact that the research that we are doing fills a gap in existing research. We want to provide a kind of conceptual view of the study. We might talk about the dependent variables that we're looking at, why they're important. We may choose to summarize key findings. And what will happen in almost every introduction is we will provide a kind of roadmap for where the paper is going. One of the most important things in writing a paper is not to lose your reader, get them so confused that they don't understand why it is you're talking about whatever you're talking about in each section. Because once the reader is lost, chances are they'll put the paper down, and then the reader is really lost. The background sections are actually a series of sections that may differ according to what type of paper you're writing. And in the series of videos under part 3 of this series, we actually look at different structures for papers, but this is the generic paper. So here are the things that you would most commonly find as separate sections in a background area of the paper. First thing is a literature review. And we actually have a specialized template in part 3 for literature reviews, so we won't go into great detail here. But the key thing about the literature review is you want to tell what the findings of the literature are, not just what people studied. And there's a tendency in a lot of literature reviews to say, you know, this author and this author studied this, while this author and this author studied that. That doesn't really provide the reader much of any useful information. What you really need to do is provide enough information so that they can understand what the findings were. Another important thing in the literature review is do not just list every piece of literature that you've read. You want to try to tell it in a storyline, or perhaps use a series of tables that help organize the literature so that the reader understands what it is that the literature actually says about what you're researching. And as I mentioned, you sometimes can use a table. The table will sometimes make it easier for the reader, because if the reader's not really interested in the literature, they can just skim the table and skip right through, as opposed to reading a narrative. Now, another section that we frequently see in the background area is the research model. And the research model might come under a variety of titles, but the goal here is to determine what the research objectives are, specify those, identify research questions. This basically identifies what it is that you're doing, and it probably will also have the kind of theoretical framework that you are using in your research. Finally, if you're doing quantitative research in particular, you may have a series of hypotheses. Hypotheses are mainly useful when the research involves some sort of a test of theory. A lot of times, authors try to put hypotheses into research projects where hypotheses really aren't that useful. I see attempts, for example, from time to time to do design science research and incorporate hypotheses, and most of the time they just make the paper seem stilted. So you need to decide what you are going to test, whether it makes sense to do hypotheses or propositions, or maybe you're not doing a test at all. Maybe you're interested in studying how an artifact was created or what was observed in a case study. And unless hypotheses really clarify things for you, you may just want to skip over them. These videos are not a substitute for training in research methods, so we're going to assume that you as a researcher who are ready to write a paper already know about your methods. So the focus here is on what you need to incorporate into the methods section of your paper. And there are a variety of things. Remember that the purpose of the methods section is to provide the reader with sufficient details so that they could replicate the research or at least make a reasonable stab at it. That adds credibility if they understand the approach you took makes sense. And in an ideal world, they would be able to take the exact method that you provide, like a recipe, and recreate the research with it. That rarely happens, but that would be the ideal. Now, the important thing about the methods section is that the structure of that section is going to need to align with the particular research method that you've employed. So in a lab experiment, for example, you might identify where the subjects came from, what tasks you asked the individuals to perform, what procedure was used, how you measured it, and very often you'll put the actual instruments that you use to gather data in an appendix. Now, different types of research are going to have very, very different types of methods, and so one of the easiest things to do is to find model papers in the same discipline that apply a similar or the same method, and in some cases are in the same journal, and look how they organize things. That will provide a nice shortcut and will increase the likelihood that you don't run into problems with the reviewers. The results section is going to sort of close out the methods section, how you executed the research according to the LIFO model. And in many ways, it naturally parallels the methods section. So its purpose is to give a factual account of the findings you have with as little interpretation as possible. You don't want to be speculating in the methods section and in the results section. You simply want to state how the method you applied produce certain results. Now, in some cases, you might report the results of hypotheses tests, true or false, but you don't really interpret them. You simply report the values. Now, the different method tests or different methods have different standard templates for results. And so you need to, just as we saw in the results section, look at other papers and see how they did it. You know, what was the order in which they described the sample, described the procedure, described the tools used to collect data, and so forth. And you try to present results the same way the papers that you're using as models presented those results. You can think of the results section as closing out the material that was introduced in the background section. So the purpose of this section will typically be to connect your research to existing theories, debates, and so forth that might have been presented in the literature review section. And you want to focus on the strengths of the research, how your research has furthered our understanding of the research model. The potential implications are often considered in the discussion. Implications for theory, implications for how something works if we're trying to understand a particular research model, how the research confirms or does not confirm what our expectations were, how our research relates to claims in other published papers, and perhaps how our research relates to the real world. So what we're really trying to do is provide the real value add of the paper for people who are interested in the paper's findings, identifying which findings are important and which findings are sort of expected. Common elements to most of your discussion sections include a recap, essentially talking about the results in terms of what we expected and their significance, a connection element where we connect the results that we had to the current theory and practice. The resolution part is very important. Here what we're trying to do is we're trying to resolve any differences in our expectations from what the actual results were. And here is where we can perhaps speculate or offer alternative possibilities that explain why our results differed from the theory. And we can then infer some implications for practice or for future research. As I mentioned, in most empirical research papers, the discussion is where the real value add is for individuals who are particularly interested in the findings or in the strengths and weaknesses of the methodology. In many cases, the conclusion section is the only one that your semi-interested reader will get to before deciding whether or not it's worth looking at the paper as a whole. As a result, it plays a very important role, but you also want to keep it down to a reasonable length so that people will read it. What it needs to do is it needs to remind the reader of what the key focus of the paper was. Remember, we can't count on them having read the rest of the paper before they get to the conclusions. And the research questions we are investigating. We want a summary of the interesting findings and implications, those things that weren't necessarily what we came in expecting. We want to connect back to the issues in the introduction. Again, this is part of the LIFO model. And when you want a kind of a formula for writing a paper, think about introducing elements in the introduction and then unwrapping them and essentially closing them off in the conclusion in the reverse order that they were introduced. Hey, it's a simple formula. It won't work for everything, but it's easier to work with than a blank page. Now, finally, there's a sort of a controversial placement, and since I've made extensive use of Dr. Devreda's slides, I am putting it where he put it here. But there is almost always going to be in a paper a section on limitations and directions for future research. Some people like to put this at the very end of the conclusion. I personally recommend putting it between the discussion section and the conclusion section, because I don't like concluding a paper by identifying the things that I did wrong and the things that I really need to do on my future because I didn't get around to doing them in this research. Now, obviously, that's a somewhat facetious way of presenting those sections, but I think it weakens the conclusion to end a paper with those. But you will find a lot of papers that do end with limitations and directions for future research. And you're almost always going to get dinged by reviewers if you do not have a section that addresses those things. Following your conclusions, you're nearly always going to have a section of references. And the primary purpose of the references is to identify the works that you have built on, that are at the core of your topic, and you want to make sure that you're up to date. So if all of your references are 3 years older or more, then you may want to try to search a little deeper in the past 3 years to determine what recent progress has been made. Some reviewers really focus on this. I have to admit, when I'm a reviewer, I don't really worry that much about the age of the references, but some people take that very seriously. Now, the other reason that you have references is one, they position your work. It helps by looking at the references, you can often figure out what particular approach a researcher is taking without even reading the paper. Researchers get very cranky if their reference, something they have written that they feel is very relevant, does not appear on the list. Journals really want to be cited because that adds to their impact factor, and so as a consequence, the journals want to see references made, and references that you make to someone else's work may call their attention to your work and may expose them to what you're doing, so they can actually help you communicate your research. One of the biggest dangers of references is what Dr. Nevretic calls the sunk cost syndrome, which is, okay, I've done all this business, read all these references, I have to put all of them on the list to show the money, the time and effort I've invested into reading the background literature. You do not want to do that in your paper. You may want to include references that you think are likely to track back to someone who's going to be a reviewer in your paper, but if you over-reference a paper, it does not make it any easier to read. And a lot of times people make citations to material that they didn't really need to cite. So if you use a reference, by all means, cite it. If you don't use a reference, if it hasn't influenced your thinking, then don't cite it simply to build up your reference list. So this is sort of a quick and dirty overview of the generic research paper. In part 3, what I do is present a series of different templates that are more specialized for different types of research, such as empirical research, literature reviews, case studies, conceptual pieces, and design science research. Associated with those are a series of Word templates that provide considerably more detail than I present in these videos. As always, if you have questions or want to contact me, my email address is grandon@usf.edu. That is grandon@usf.edu, and I'd be happy to try to answer any inquiries you have. Thank you very much.